In this place, the living trade for ghosts, while the dead come to collect souls. Here, earth-shattering deals are made, the kind that turn every human moral upside down. Picture this. A wealthy socialite, desperate to secure a spot for her children in a prestigious school, doesn't blink twice at sacrificing 5 human lives to seal the deal. At a nearby shop, the display windows don't show silk or lace, but burial shrouds stitched together from actual human skin, shattering every sacred taboo in folklore. In this twisted economy where life is the only currency, you have to wonder, who is the merchant and who is the merchandise? Our story begins in a remote, desolate village. Meet Mian. She's a famous mystery novelist, often nicknamed the Soul Seller because of how obsessively she pours her life into her work. In a desperate search for fresh inspiration, she ventured alone into the deep, unforgiving wilderness, setting up a secluded cabin right next to a massive, ancient tree. Every year, as the last breath of autumn fades, the villagers invite a shaman to perform a grim ritual. They offer fresh meat and raw blood to an ancient scholar tree, the guardian that has supposedly protected the village for centuries. Legend says this ritual has been practiced for over 1,000 years without a single hitch. But this year, things are different. No matter how frantically the shaman performs his incantations, the ancient tree remains barren, refusing to bloom or bear fruit. The villagers see this as a catastrophic omen, a sign of divine wrath, and they scramble to organize another sacrifice to beg the tree god for forgiveness. What they don't know is that the village chief has been bought. He's been bribed by a corrupt developer to clear the land for a golf course. Under the cover of darkness, the chief sneaks out to the tree and pours a toxic chemical into its roots, hoping to kill it once and for all. But just as he's committing the sacrilege, his nose begins to bleed. A hot, thick stream of blood. Cursing his luck, he casually wipes the blood onto the dry, shriveled bark of the tree. In the very next second, something impossible happens. The dying scholar tree suddenly jolts back to life, pulsing with a terrifying vitality. The village chief stands frozen in horror, completely unaware that the tree is absorbing his blood at a visible speed. A cloud of strange, ghostly white pollen erupts from the trunk, swirling into his nostrils and making him sneeze uncontrollably. Terrified, he grabs his tools and bolts from the scene. But the nightmare was only beginning. By the next morning, the tree that had looked so vibrant the night before was once again a skeletal, dead husk. However, the air was now thick with that mysterious white pollen, drifting through the village like a fog. Mian, watching from a distance, couldn't wrap her head around it. But the moment she came into contact with the dust, she let out a loud sneeze, exactly like the chief had done. She brushed it off, thinking that plants blooming in late autumn weren't that unusual. She had no idea that this pollen was about to become a death sentence for the entire village. From that moment on, the tree grew more and more grotesque, and panic began to spread like wildfire. The villagers were convinced the golf course project had offended the tree god, and they turned their rage on the chief. But the old man was stubborn, arrogantly claiming, "It's my land, I'll do what I want," to shut them down. The confrontation ended in a bitter, uneasy silence. As the chief stormed off, Mian's sharp eyes caught something chilling. There was a strange lump on the back of his neck, a growth that looked as if something alive, some kind of insect, was about to crawl out from under his skin. The sight sent a shiver down her spine. Back at her cabin, she began digging into the history of the tree god ritual and discovered a dark record dating back to 1994. According to ancient lore, the blooming of the scholar tree is a blessing, a shield for the people. But if the tree stops blooming, it means its regenerative power is failing, and its divine energy is fading away. Mian became so consumed by these haunting legends that she lost track of time. It wasn't until the sun began to dip below the horizon that she snapped out of it. Driven by a dark curiosity, she headed back toward the ancient tree one more time, desperate to see if the supernatural rumors were actually true. Right there on the gnarled bark, a pristine white flower slowly unfurled, as if it were whispering to her, luring her to reach out and touch it. But before she could, a stranger suddenly stepped out of the shadows, making Mian jump out of her skin. The man didn't seem sorry for the scare at all. He just stood there, muttering under his breath to the ancient tree, claiming that the tree god had lost its soul, that what stood before them was nothing more than an empty, hollow shell. Mian, naturally, thought the guy was completely losing it. I mean, who in their right mind acts that crazy in the middle of the woods? Anxious to get away, she hurried back toward home. But on the trail, she stopped dead in her tracks. The entire path was now carpeted in those same eerie white flowers. The scene was so hauntingly beautiful, so macabre, that her writer's instinct kicked in. She felt a surge of inspiration and immediately pulled out her phone to capture the moment. But when she looked at the screen, her heart nearly stopped. In the photo, there wasn't just a path of flowers. There was a blood-soaked skull staring back at her. Her eyes darted from the screen to the ground, and that's when she saw it. A nameless, rotting corpse lying right in front of her. Then the unthinkable happened. The corpse's jaw unhinged, its mouth stretching wide, and an infinite cloud of white pollen erupted from its throat like a geyser. At this point, Mian didn't need to be told twice. She realized this was a nightmare she needed to escape immediately. She turned and ran like her life depended on it. When she finally made it home, she frantically told her best friend what happened. But her friend wouldn't buy a word of it. She laughed it off, telling Mian she'd been writing too many mystery novels and was becoming paranoid. Frustrated and desperate to prove she wasn't crazy, Mian snapped a photo of where she thought the danger was and sent it over. But you can't wake someone who's pretending to be asleep. Her friend replied, saying she didn't see any corpse at all. Instead, she pointed out something else. Hey, you should really do something about that nasty-looking pimple on your neck. Mian felt her skin crawl. She reached up, fumbled around her neck, and finally felt it. She quickly hung up, rushing to the mirror to deal with the blemish. After all, for a woman like Mian, her skin was her pride, her second face. But in her vanity, she had no idea that this one act of popping a pimple was about to lead to the total destruction of her own beauty. At that very moment, the mysterious man back at the tree seemed to sense the shift in the air. He whispered that the tree god's flowers had begun to bloom all along the path. And just like that, the pimple on Mian's neck underwent a gruesome transformation. Before she could even process the impossibility of a flower growing out of human flesh, her survival instinct took over. She grabbed the bloody, rose-like growth and pulled with all her might. The pain was blinding. She looked in the mirror and realized with horror that the roots were intertwined with her very own muscle fibers. This wasn't just some pollen that had landed in a wound. Her entire body had become a laboratory, a living petri dish for this parasitic plant. In a state of pure, unadulterated panic, she sprinted outside screaming for help. She saw the villagers gathering, heading toward the ancient tree. For a split second, she thought she'd found a lifeline. She lunged toward them, hoping for salvation. But that hope was extinguished in an instant. As she got closer, she saw the truth. Every single villager had already been infested by that freakish pollen. They weren't human anymore. They were nothing but hollowed-out puppets controlled by the tree god. Everything finally clicked. The 1,000-year-old tree really had protected this village, but the villagers' greed, their willingness to betray their protector for a golf course, had killed the tree's spirit. And when the divine protection vanished, the ghost market immediately caught the scent of human desire. Legend has it, wherever humans are desperate enough to trade their souls, the ghost market appears. It makes a deal, but the price is always the thing you value most. The ghost market had sensed the villagers' greed and baited them by luring in the wealthy developer. But the fee for this deal was their lives. They had all been turned into fertilizer to feed the ancient tree. Those snow-white flowers? They weren't a blessing. They were the mark placed on the prey. Realizing the game was up, Mian struggled to crawl back to her house. But it was too late. The pollen had already taken root deep within her. She was fast becoming a string-pulled puppet, just like the rest of them. But Mian was a fighter. How could she ever just lie down and accept a fate as gruesome as this? But no matter how much blood pooled on the floor, it was useless. Her fate had been sealed long ago. She was to become nothing more than high-grade fertilizer to keep the 1,000-year-old tree alive. By dawn, the village was a graveyard of silence. Not a single living soul remained. In their place, countless agonized faces were now permanently etched into the gnarled bark of the tree. Gorged on the life force of an entire village, the ancient scholar tree had returned to life. But its once pure spirit was now blackened, stained forever by human greed and ambition. It had transformed into a living bridge for the ghost market, lurking in the shadows, silently waiting for the next person desperate enough to trade their soul for their desires. Our second story takes us to the concrete jungle of downtown Seoul. Meet Chai-won, an ordinary office worker. Although she was naturally quite pretty, she suffered from severe body dysmorphia. She was pathologically insecure, especially about the small bump on the bridge of her nose. But the ghost market heard her cries, and it decided to offer her a beauty consultation she would never forget. One day, while walking through her apartment hallway, her eyes were drawn to a package labeled Angel's Visage. Even though she pretended not to care, Chai-won waited until the coast was clear and swiped the package from her neighbor's doorstep. After all, this wasn't her first time stealing. But this time, things were different. Her neighbor, who usually stayed quiet and let things slide, actually came knocking. She demanded to know if Chai-won had stolen her delivery. Chai-won's heart nearly leaped out of her chest, but she decided the best defense was a good offense, acting aggressively to shut the woman up. Only when the hallway went dead silent did she finally breathe a sigh of relief. She peered through the peephole to check the situation and was nearly scared to death by a bloodshot eye staring right back at her from the other side. She tried to steady her breathing and looked again, but in just a few seconds, the neighbor had vanished without a trace, as if the whole thing had been a hallucination. To a thief like Chai-won, however, this was a win. Her curiosity took over. What could be inside that package that her neighbor was so desperate to get back? She tore it open to find a bizarre human face mask. Right in the center was the perfect, straight nose Chai-won had always dreamed of. She didn't hesitate. She put it on. The prosthetic nose fused instantly to her skin, sticking tight to her face. Instead of being terrified, she was overwhelmed with pure joy. Her greatest flaw was gone. With her new, perfect nose, the compliments from her coworkers started rolling in, leaving her in a state of absolute euphoria. But human greed is a bottomless pit. Once she had a taste of perfection, she wanted more. Chai-won set her sights on her neighbor's packages once again. This time, it was a pair of stunning, amber-colored eyeballs. She couldn't wait to put them in. With those amber eyes, she took on a captivating, exotic beauty. From that point on, there was no stopping her. She became obsessed, frantically stealing her neighbor's deliveries. To her, stolen beauty was the most exquisite jewelry in the world. She became so comfortable with her thievery that she stopped paying attention to the world around her. That is, until a voice suddenly drifted out from her mirror. "Room 603, right?" The words froze the blood in her veins. But a split second later, a heavy pounding on her door snapped her back to reality. She told herself it was just her own guilt-driven hallucinations. But the knocking grew more violent, more rhythmic. By now, Chai-won had practiced her lies enough to respond smoothly. She figured her neighbor would eventually realize she wasn't getting anywhere and just leave. But as the saying goes, even a worm will turn. Pushed to the brink, the neighbor wasn't going away. Panicked, Chai-won grabbed a heavy stick. In her twisted mind, she wasn't the one at fault. She blamed her neighbor for the harassment and decided it was time for a final showdown. In an instant, the woman burst through the door, exploding with all the pent-up rage she had been holding back. But Chai-won wasn't about to back down easily. She stood her ground and immediately threw herself into a violent, desperate struggle with her opponent. When Chai-won saw the woman reaching for a spoon, clearly intending to pry the stolen merchandise right off her face, something inside her snapped. In a desperate, violent bid to protect her new beauty, Chai-won exploded with a terrifying, inhuman strength, shoving the neighbor toward her death. At this point, there was no turning back. Chai-won dragged the neighbor's lifeless body into the bathroom. In this twisted war to preserve her looks, she had technically won, but at the cost of her freedom and whatever remained of her soul. Our third story follows a mother and daughter. The daughter, Soo-yeon, was a textbook underachiever, famous for being at the very bottom of her class. But she didn't seem to care one bit, spending all her time running wild with a bad crowd. Her mother, Hui-jin, was worried sick. One day, when Hui-jin heard that the daughter of the local community leader had ranked first in the entire grade, the jealousy in her eyes was practically overflowing. Desperate to get her own daughter into medical school, Hui-jin swallowed her pride the next morning and went to the community leader to beg for her secret. First, the woman refused to talk, but after Hui-jin's relentless pestering, she finally cracked and revealed the truth. Her daughter's success was all thanks to the help of demons. Hui-jin stood there, stunned. She couldn't believe that this woman, someone who never seemed the religious or superstitious type, would make up such a ridiculous, supernatural lie just to hide her secret. The neighbor was clearly offended. It had taken all her courage to tell the truth, only for Hui-jin to treat it like a joke. Seeing this, Hui-jin finally started to take it seriously. As bizarre as the story sounded, if it could actually boost her daughter's grades, she didn't care if she had to deal with ghosts or walk through fire and brimstone. She was going to do it. Following the address she was given, Hui-jin eventually found herself at a remote, dilapidated building. On her way in, she caught a glimpse of someone covered in horrific injuries, which made her hesitate for a moment. But in the end, her ambition won out. No matter what, she had to meet this ghost that could guarantee academic success. All she had to do was find room 414, and her daughter would be a shoo-in for medical school. However, something was wrong. No matter how many times she searched the hallway, room 414 was nowhere to be found. She began to doubt if the whole story was just a cruel prank. But then, in the very next second, room 414 abruptly appeared right behind her. Hui-jin felt a sudden, icy chill race down her spine. But with her daughter's future on the line, she suppressed her terror and reached for the door handle. She had to wonder, though, what kind of nightmare was hidden behind a room that appears out of thin air. Mustering every ounce of courage, Hui-jin stepped inside. The door slammed shut behind her with a heavy thud. The interior was suffocatingly bleak, And once again, she felt the urge to turn and run. As she stood there, paralyzed by indecision, the lights began to flicker violently, shredding her already frayed nerves. Finally, after a brutal internal struggle, she reached out and yanked open a rusted cabinet door. Even though the space inside was pitch black, she decided she'd come too far to quit now. She closed her eyes and took a leap of faith into the darkness. She had no idea that this was only the very first easiest step of the deal. After walking through the dark for what felt like an eternity, Hui Jin finally entered the lair of the demons. She remembered the community leader's warning. Keep your head down and walk straight to the altar of the ghost market. But even with all her mental preparation, she nearly jumped out of her skin when a ghost bride suddenly manifested in front of her. Luckily, her sacrifice was finally about to pay off. To get the Ghost King's approval, she had to drench a snow-white silk pouch, hidden inside a bronze basin, with her own fresh blood. Following a blood-curdling, soul-piercing scream, the white silk pouch in the basin was finally dyed a deep, permanent crimson. But the massive blood loss was too much for Hui Jin's body to handle, and she blacked out on the spot. When she finally opened her eyes, she found that the Ghost King had transported her back to the world of the living. And there, sitting right beside her, was the grim secret to her daughter's academic success. As soon as she got home, Hui Jin hid a mysterious ritual jar under Su Yun's bed. Then, she carefully sewed the sacred talisman onto Su Yun's favorite doll. Now, here's the thing. Once a deal like this is made, there is one golden rule: that talisman can never fall off. If it does, the price you pay will be beyond your worst nightmares. At that moment, Hui Jin was blinded by her daughter's grades. She had no idea that her desperate, short-sighted gamble was about to bury both of their lives. Thanks to the talisman's dark power, Su Yun's grades didn't just improve, they skyrocketed. Even her personality began to change. But as her scores climbed higher and higher, the ghost market's demands grew hungrier. The price became agonizing. It started with Hui Jin having to pull out one of her own teeth. Then, she had to soak that silk pouch in her fresh blood over and over again, leaving her body dangerously frail and withered. But in her mind, seeing Su Yun get a perfect score in every single subject made every drop of blood worth it. However, the joy was short-lived. Disaster was already knocking at the door. Seeing Su Yun's sudden transformation into a genius, her friends couldn't help but tease and play around with her. But during the commotion, the unthinkable happened. The doll with the talisman sewn onto it hit the floor. The tragedy began instantly. At home, while Hui Jin was cutting meat, her hand slipped, and the knife sliced deep into her flesh. At the exact same moment, Su Yun's nose began to gush blood. Because the talisman had touched the ground, Su Yun collapsed in her room that night. Hui Jin rushed her daughter to the doctor, but the tests came back clear. Nothing was physically wrong with the girl. Ironically, it was the mother that the doctor was worried about. Seeing how ghostly pale and sickly she looked, the doctor urged Hui Jin to get a checkup herself. Hui Jin just brushed it off with a weak smile. After all, this was the path she had chosen. But by that night, the weight of regret finally hit her. She decided she wanted their normal life back. She wanted to cancel the deal, but she forgot the most important rule of the underworld. Once a deal is made, there is no backing out. Her attempt to break the contract enraged the Ghost King. A violent, unnatural wind began to howl through the room. Sensing something was horribly wrong, Hui Jin tried to stand up, but the door slammed shut with a bang, locking her in. Then, the horror escalated. The scar on her hand was violently ripped open by an invisible force, and her blood began to spray across the room like a fountain. At that same moment, because Hui Jin had broken the pact, Su Yun was targeted right in the middle of her exam. The classroom doors were blown open by a supernatural gust. This was the mark of divine punishment. Su Yun watched in absolute horror as every single person in the room became possessed. They all stared fixedly at the ceiling, their bodies twitching and convulsing with terrifying intensity. Remembering a fox's window hand sign ritual she had seen online to reveal spirits, Su Yun desperately mimicked the gesture. Through the gap in her fingers, she finally saw the hideous truth behind her classmates' convulsions. But even worse, the demon that was possessing them noticed her, too. Paralyzed with fear, Su Yun screamed for her mother and ran for her life. But a deal is a deal, and it cannot be broken. She had to pay the price. Back at the house, Hui Jin took her final breath, dying from massive blood loss. It's a grim reminder. There are no shortcuts in life. Hui Jin's obsession, which she disguised as motherly love, was a death sentence from the very start. Our fourth story takes us into the investigation of a truly bizarre robbery. Officer Dong-sik was the gold standard of the police force. He was a decorated veteran with a long list of heroic achievements under his belt, a man who had seen it all. Or so he thought. Dong-sik had gone rogue, acting without a warrant or backup, and his superiors had disciplined him for it. Since then, that failure had been like a thorn in his side, a constant itch he couldn't scratch. He was desperate for a win, a chance to redeem himself and wash away the shame. And the ghost market? It was listening to his every desire. One day, Dong-sik and his junior partner were ordered to track down a robbery suspect. By some stroke of luck, or so they thought, they crossed paths with the target on the street. Blinded by his thirst for glory, Dong-sik lost it. He drew his service weapon, ready to execute the suspect on the spot, just to close the case. Thankfully, his young partner intervened just in time, but the distraction allowed the suspect to vanish into the shadows. Dong-sik was livid, swearing to himself that he would catch that man at any cost. After an obsessive manhunt, he finally pinpointed the suspect's location. But a familiar problem arose. They had no search warrant. Stepping inside would mean another disciplinary hearing, maybe even the end of their careers. But Dong-sik's ambition had already swallowed his common sense. Ignoring the frantic pleas of his junior, he kicked the door open and stepped inside. They had no idea that they were walking straight into a trap meticulously laid by the ghost market. The entry fee for this deal was their very lives. The interior of the house was a nightmare. It didn't look like anyone lived there. There were no couches, no photos, just a single, withered tree blooming with those haunting white flowers. It was the only guest in the house. The scene was so eerie and unnatural that Dong-sik's survival instincts finally flared up. He told his partner to stay glued to his back as they pushed deeper into the gloom. Despite their police training, the sheer gore they encountered nearly broke them. They found iron boxes overflowing with human eyeballs and internal organs. It was clear, this wasn't just a petty robber they were chasing. Looking at the rows of cell phones lined up on a table, Dong-sik realized he had stumbled upon a massive organ trafficking ring. Instead of fear, a wave of dark euphoria washed over him. If he took down an entire syndicate by himself, he wouldn't just be redeemed, he'd be a legend at the precinct. Driven by ego, he flatly refused his partner's request to call for backup. He insisted on cracking this blood-soaked case alone. But he had fatally underestimated the cruelty of the monsters behind this operation. In a nearby fish tank, severed human fingers drifted at the bottom like sunken debris. As he stared in horror, a strange noise echoed from the next room. Dong-sik kicked the door open, expecting to find a hostage. Instead, a stench so foul it felt like a physical blow hit them. On the bed lay a body covered in blood. Cursing the animals who did this, Dong-sik violently yanked back the blanket. His heart stopped. The rotting corpse on the bed was the very suspect they had been chasing just hours ago. The timeline didn't make sense. The case was spiraling out of control. Suddenly, another noise came from another room. Dong-sik, now acting on pure, terrified adrenaline, pushed inside. He found another blood-drenched body, and in the bathroom sink, he saw something that defied logic. What looked like a woman's brain, her knowledge displayed like a trophy. His junior partner couldn't take it anymore. He bolted outside and began to vomit uncontrollably. But as he doubled over, he accidentally stumbled upon another crime scene, the one that would officially open the gates of hell for both of them. Inside, they found a young girl whose body was being consumed by parasitic flowers. Right next to her was a wall of monitors showing a live CCTV feed of the entire house. The realization hit Dong-sik like a freight train. From the second they stepped through the door, every move they made had been watched. The sheer cold-blooded planning of the killer sent a shiver down his spine. Miraculously, the girl was still clinging to life. Finally waking up from his delusions of glory, Dong-sik agreed to let his partner call headquarters for reinforcements. He finally understood that his life was worth more than a hollow promotion. But it was too late. The ghost market had already come to collect its reward. Just as the two of them stepped out of the door, a strange, nightmarish creature lunged from the shadows, attacking the junior officer. Dong-sik didn't hesitate. He swung his flashlight around, the beam finally cutting through the dark to reveal the attacker's hideous form. Panicked, he drew his weapon and fired, but it was no use. The attacker managed to grab the junior and drag him screaming into the abyss. Dong-sik sprinted after the trail of blood, but what he found at the end was a scene of such pure horror that it would be burned into his mind forever. Fueled by a mix of grief and absolute rage, Dong-sik emptied 3 rounds into the monster, finally forcing the terrifying man to retreat. He scrambled to the ground, picked up his partner's severed finger, and hauled the mangled junior officer toward the exit. By now, Dong-sik's heart was heavy with nothing but bone-deep regret. He kept whispering to his partner, begging him to stay awake, telling him not to close his eyes. But it was already too late. Even though Dong-sik had risked everything to take down that monster, he had been pierced through by razor-sharp thorns during the struggle. He was now gasping for his final breaths. In his dying moments, he still tried to drag his partner out of that hellhole. But then, the mysterious man from the underworld market appeared, his presence alone acting as a herald of their death. And there, on the junior's torn open throat, countless snow-white flowers began to bloom. It was the undeniable mark of a deal with the underworld market. Later, the police department honored them both as fallen heroes, but the price of that glory was their very lives. Our final story also involves the police, but the central figure is a female college student who met a truly gruesome end. To understand what happened, we have to go back a few days. Meet Eun Seo. She was a Korean exchange student who had moved to Vietnam to study. She was also an aspiring streamer, a rookie trying to make a name for herself. The problem was that the internet is flooded with pretty girls, and no matter how much she streamed, she just couldn't get any traction. She was a nobody in a sea of somebodies. But then, during a folklore class, the underworld market heard the burning desire in Eun Seo's heart. The professor was lecturing about spirits and demons, how even if they seem like myths, one must always maintain a sense of fear and respect. He brought up a local urban legend, a vacant, abandoned lot near the university that people whispered was a gateway to the spirit world. The professor's goal was to warn his students to stay away from these taboos. But Eun Seo, she saw it as nothing more than a golden opportunity for clout. She decided to form a group of 3 and livestream an investigation to see if the place was really as haunted as the legends claimed. The move worked. Her stream blew up. Viewers started pouring in, egging the group on, daring them to climb over the barbed wire fences and venture deeper into the forbidden zone. They were so distracted by the rising view count that they didn't notice a protective talisman silently falling off behind them. Before long, the 3 of them reached an old, dried-up well. According to the legends, this was the exact portal for the souls of the dead. Looking down into that bottomless, dark pit, Eun Seo didn't feel a shred of fear. In fact, she was practically praying for a ghost to appear. She wanted a jump scare. She wanted to become a viral sensation. Just then, one of her friends, who had dabbled in the occult, decided to show off. He performed a ritual where you do a handstand to see ghosts between your legs. Eun Seo just scoffed at him. She decided to show them the real deal, the famous Korean ritual known as the fox's window. She explained that by intertwining your fingers into a specific shape and chanting a spell, you could see spirits that are normally invisible to the human eye. Her friend, Lana, was instantly hooked and rushed over to try it at the edge of the dry well. But the moment she looked through the window, her face went pale. She saw a dark shadow lurking deep within the pit. Eun Seo thought she was just joking around until Lana suddenly went stiff, standing there like a statue. That's when the real panic set in. It was obvious that Lana hadn't just seen a ghost. Some kind of malevolent entity had seized control of her body. Realizing something was horribly wrong, the other 2 tried to drag her away, but Lana seemed completely numb, as if her soul had already left the building. In that suffocating, supernatural atmosphere, they had no choice but to bolt, leaving the area as fast as their legs could carry them. What they didn't notice in the chaos was that Lana's face had already been torn into a grisly, bloody mess of shredded flesh. It wasn't until they finally reached a safe zone that they realized the unthinkable. Lana was gone. She had vanished into thin air. In the aftermath, Eun Seo was absolutely consumed by soul-crushing regret. She was convinced that her hunger for fame had directly caused Lana's disappearance. But she had no idea that the real punishment was only just beginning. After trying to comfort Eun Seo, the other friend, Dae-hee, went into the restroom to wash the blood off her hands. But just as she was about to leave, she heard a chilling sound, the slow, rhythmic drip-drip-drip of water from the sink. Dae-hee spun around in a panic, but her body suddenly locked up. She was frozen to the spot, completely losing control of her own limbs. Then, her hands began to move on their own, twisting into the eerie fox's window hand sign. In the mirror, her own reflection wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was staring back at her with a haunting intensity, gesturing for her to look down at the floor. There, crawling on the tiles, was the female ghost, her pale hand already clutching Dae-hee's ankle. Just as Dae-hee reached the peak of her despair, her screams brought other students running into the room. But strangely, the restroom floor was empty. To everyone else, it looked like Dae-hee was just having a mental breakdown. But the terrifying, bruised handprint left on her skin told her a different story. This was no hallucination. This was real. Dae-hee knew their time was running out. Their doom had arrived. Desperate to find the demon behind all this, she pulled out her phone to re-watch the footage from the well. Looking through the fox's window that Lana had made in the video, she finally saw it, the true, hideous face of the evil spirit. Realizing how dire the situation was, Dae-hee tried to contact Eun Seo the very next morning. But she was one step too late. Refusing to believe the worst, Dae-hee forced her way into the crime scene, only to witness a sight so gruesome and horrific it defied description. The trauma of what she saw left a permanent, dark shadow on her mind. She rushed to the police station to provide her lead, but the officers just dismissed her, thinking she was too traumatized to be thinking clearly. She was left alone, wondering what tragic end was waiting for her in the shadows. With nowhere else to turn, Dahi went to her professor as her last hope. The professor dropped a bombshell. To end the haunting once and for all, she had to collect a piece of the spirit, either its hair or a fingernail. If she could seal that piece inside a specific ceramic jar, she might actually stand a chance of surviving. Driven by pure desperation, Dahi forced herself to go back to that dried-up well. And there, tucked into a small crevice, she actually found it, the demon's fingernail. But the moment she reached for it, disaster struck. When Dahi opened her eyes again, she had the fingernail, but she had been dragged into the underworld market. Remembering the professor's instructions, she fought through her paralyzing fear and walked toward the center of the sacrificial altar. But there was a twist she never saw coming. This wasn't a ritual to seal the demon. According to the professor's twisted logic, this was the only way to save Dahi's soul. By doing this, Dahi had unknowingly finalized a deal with the underworld market. She wasn't saved. She was transformed. Dahi became a monster, a new resident of the underworld, destined to be used as bait to lure in the next greedy human. The series ends here. If you enjoyed it, don't hesitate to give me a like, comment, and subscribe.